At NAB this year, I was literally talking to Caleb and even chatted with Small Rig about how somebody needs to make a better and more convenient way to change and put on ND filters. Well, guess what? This new Helix Maglock system from PolarPro solved this. But there is still a problem that we will get into that these filters from NiSi, the True Color Swift filters, solve. We're also going to get into the advantages and disadvantages of both of these variable ND systems and things that I think could be improved on both systems. Oh, and if you're new here, my name's Dustin, your video tour guide, and I'm so behind on content that my gear is literally everywhere. I guess like the video if you relate. Let's go. First things first, full disclosure, NiSi did send me this filter system in exchange for a YouTube video, but all of my thoughts and opinions are my own. They do want me to highlight some specific things on this filter, which we will get into. And PolarPro was also so kind to hook me up with the Helix Maglock system, but literally didn't even ask me to make a video or anything. So shout out to them. Now, I've been a big fan of PolarPro NDs for a while now. I do still own the older variable NDs. Actually, one second. To be specific, these ones, they're like the version 2 of the Peter McKinnon ones. The big thing that I loved about these old filters is the protection that's on them, like this little rubber cap and like the screw-on backs. Like, I just love that. When they're in my bag, they just don't take up a lot of space and they're just convenient, in my opinion. Well, let's talk about the differences between these kind of more up-to-date options. First off, the price. The NiSi Swift True Color Variable ND system will cost you $309 if you go with at least the 82mm thread version. They do vary a bit depending on the thread that you choose to go with, but generally about $300. It comes with 2 filters, a 1 to 5 stop variable ND and a 4 ND, which we will explain why that is later. It comes with this case and a cap right here that goes on the front of the ND when it's on your camera. Now, the Helix Maglock filter will cost you about $299 if you just want to buy the 2 to 5 filter. You can get it in a kit for $329 that will include a 70mm base and an 82mm base that screws on to your camera, and this is how the filter locks onto your lens. I'll explain all that in a second. But then, if you want to have the 6 to 9 filter, it's going to cost you another $299. So to just match the amount of stops that the NiSi offers, you're going to have to spend over double the amount. But let me talk about the biggest advantage to this whole Maglock system. So there's these base plates that you have to buy. There's one on this lens right here, if you can, as you can see. Basically, you screw this onto the front of your lens, and then you just leave it on. Even if you buy the 82mm base plate, like this one, you can see that it's slightly bigger, and all you have to do is just take off the covers like this. They're also called defenders, and then it's just as simple as just like that. All you do, just let it magnetize on, and then turn, and it locks in place. Like, guys, this is exactly what I was hoping somebody would make, because I know you can relate when you're shooting something where you gotta move quick and you need to change not only the lenses, but bring the ND onto that other lens. It's really annoying to unscrew the ND, then screw it on to the other lens, and sometimes your step-up rings or your UV filter, if you have one of those on, unscrews with it. And if you're using cheap step-up rings, sometimes they get stuck on the ND and then you're fiddling around and you look like an idiot. Yeah, with this system, it takes like 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, less than 5 seconds. And something that's really cool, which is what I did with these base plates, is I actually put them on literally all of my lenses. So now these defenders that are on the front, they act like a lens cap, and I can just leave the base plates on literally all of my lenses. I actually had a 2-day shoot where I got to test this in action, and seriously, it was absolutely game-changing. Now, there are 2 problems I'm going to address about this system, but let me talk about the NiSi and how it works in comparison. So it's kind of similar in a way. The 1 to 5 stop ND still uses like the traditional screw thread, which is, you know, there's nothing new there. Now you can't really tell, but it is a bit bigger on the outside of the lens right here. This is nice because they actually purposely do that to help avoid vignetting, which we'll look at examples later. But it also includes this 4-stop ND that just basically fits on the front of this, just like that. And then it will change this entire setup from a 1 to 5-stop variable ND to a 1 to 9-stop ND. Very clever. Oh, you can also remove this little screw, by the way. This actually, in a way, beats out the PolarPro system because you don't have to change NDs if you're going into a darker or brighter environment. And it also goes all the way down to 1 stop, where the PolarPro starts at 2 stops. So you could potentially keep the ND on if you move from different environments like outside to inside, whereas with the PolarPro, you may have to remove it just depending on how dark the new scene is. So potentially the only time you'd need to remove the ND is when you change lenses, but it's still just not as convenient as the Maglock system, in my opinion. Now, the Maglock might be more convenient. And like I mentioned earlier, I put these little like base plates on all of my lenses to act as even as just my lens caps. But then there's a problem when it comes to storage. I use the Nomadic Peter McKinnon bag for perspective, which I love, but I noticed that when I have these on my lenses and start putting them into my bag, it gets pretty cramped, and I end up having to play quite a bit of Tetris in order to get everything to fit. It's possible you could run into this problem too with different bags, so I just wanted to call it out. So while the Helix Maglock system solves a lot of problems when it comes to convenience, there are some other inconveniences as well, which leads me to probably the biggest problem with this system, the ND quality. I'm going to show some examples in a bit, but while I was using this system, I noticed that my image had a slight green hue to it. Now you might say, well, this is a common issue when it comes to using variable NDs, and there's not really a way to avoid it. And that's where I say that this is where the NiSi truly shines. This is specifically what NiSi wanted me to highlight about this system, is how true to color it is across all stops. Let's look at some examples and some comparisons against the Helix NDs. So this first shot right here is just a shot with no NDs on, so you can get an idea of the color. And then this next shot right here is what it looks like with the NiSi on at 1 stop. Now, since the PolarPro doesn't have 1 stop, it basically starts at 2 stops. There's no comparison here, but let's just look at the color difference between the first one and the second one. There's really hardly any difference. They've really done a good job already just from looking at this. There might be a slight change, but nothing really that noticeable to the eye. Now let's jump up to 2 stops and compare both the NiSi and the PolarPro against no ND. And as you can see, the PolarPro does have some slight changes in color, and it's hard to tell as well. I don't know how well this is going to translate to YouTube, but from my eyes and what I see, there is a bigger difference from the NiSi, but it's still not really that noticeable. And just to kind of breeze through this a little bit quicker, pretty much in comparison from 1 to 5 and 2 to 5 between the NiSi and the PolarPro version, they're actually pretty good quality. Like I said, the PolarPro does have a little more color shift than the NiSi, but it's really not that bad. But then when you compare 6 to 9 stops on the PolarPro versus the NiSi, this is where the PolarPro really kind of falls apart. So in this shot right here, I wanted to give you guys a more clear visual on what I see comparing the images. So what I did is I took the NiSi 1 to 5 and the PolarPro 2 to 5 and started at 1 stop and went all the way up to 5 stops, just kind of continuously to see how consistent the ND is. And then I did the same thing with the PolarPro. And as you can see, 1 to 5 and 2 to 5, it's really good. It holds up really well across the entire image. And also, I forgot to mention, I am shooting this at 16 millimeters because I want to make sure that what I'm seeing is basically the entirety of the ND, so I can give you guys the best visual of what I'm seeing. If I was using like a 50 millimeter, you may not notice this as much. Just keep that in mind that at wider focal lengths, you are going to notice this more. So now, when I go from 5 to 9 on the NiSi, it also holds up pretty well. There's a slight bigger difference. And if you look over at the scope, you can kind of see that, I forgot what it's called, but that X pattern that you get with using a variable ND, but it's still very good, very well controlled. Whereas with the PolarPro, it's not so good. If you look over at the scope, as I go up to 9, you can really see that X cross pattern, and you can also see it just with your eyes as well. Now, I wanted to also shoot a few examples outside because it, you know, I just think it's a good kind of visual reference. When we take a look at some of those examples, we see kind of the same thing. The NiSi holds up really well in comparison to no ND, and then the NiSi, it looks pretty similar. There might be slight differences in contrast, but that also could just be because the light is changing a little bit because this is kind of golden hour sunset shot. But when you take the NiSi and compare it to the PolarPro, it's kind of confirmed, at least from my view. Again, I don't know how this is translating onto YouTube, but it looks like there's more of like that green kind of overcast. Now, to be fair, that does stay pretty consistent throughout all the stops on the PolarPro, but when you compare it to the NiSi, like, it just holds up a lot better in my opinion. And when we compare the two when it comes to vignetting, at 16 millimeters, I wasn't getting any vignetting on either of them, and this was shot in 6K open gate, so you're getting a little more height on the footage just to really compare. So after looking at some comparisons, it all just really comes down to what you want. If you want a better value for the quality of the ND and you're willing to sacrifice some convenience, the NiSi is really the way to go. If you want the extreme convenience of the Helix Maglock system and you are willing to sacrifice some quality and have the budget, then they might be for you. Oh, and like I mentioned earlier, the Helix system also offers some more filters that work with the system, like mist, anamorphic flares, and even a variable ND mist combination. They do stack, so if this were like a mist filter, you can just stack it right on there, just like that. This is just kind of a little side note as well. I did notice when I changed the ND that sometimes this can actually unlock. Maybe it was on the 2-5. I noticed it more on one of the NDs when I had it on here. Yeah, so on my 2-5, when I go to change the ND, it actually unlocks itself. So slight flaw in this, but it's easily combated by just kind of holding your thumb there, and then you can change the ND without it screwing off. Not a huge deal, but just be aware of that. I do wonder how well these will hold up over time, but I'm actually somebody who has dealt with PolarPro's lifetime warranty program. They are good about warrantying stuff. I actually had the first version of these NDs, and then what happened was the ND was starting to get kind of loose, and in the inside, I could see grease getting in there. I sent them a picture though, and they were like, yeah, we don't make those NDs anymore. That's not normal. We need to replace them. And then they were like, but we'll just send you these ones instead. So as far as customer service goes, at least in my experience, PolarPro has been great. I can't really speak to NiSi, but they've been great to work with, I guess, if that speaks to anything. Something to keep in mind though, since it's a bit pricey for the Helix system, you could even buy 2 sets of NiSi filters and keep them on your most commonly used lenses. I don't know, just a thought. I personally will probably be using both since there are pros and cons to both, and I'd prefer to use the NiSi on the more slower pace shoots, whereas I'll probably use the Helix system on a more run and gun solo shoot. The last thing I just want to throw out to both PolarPro and NiSi when it comes to these systems, I would love it if PolarPro made diopters that work with this system. I shoot with Sirui anamorphic lenses from time to time on my setup, and convenient diopters without screw-on threads still don't exist. Huge opportunity there, PolarPro, with this Maglock system. I'm telling you, I would buy them at the speed of light. And then for NiSi, I actually really like this stackable design that you guys have made. I think you guys should expand on this. Maybe make a base thread. So right here, kind of similar to like the Maglock system, put a base thread here and then make this the same as this front ND where you can just kind of suction it on. It doesn't necessarily need magnets or any kind of lock. It just needs to be exactly like this. Like, it's really solid. I'm very confident that this filter that's on the front, even if I'm sprinting around, it's probably not gonna come off. You've got one of the best qualities in my opinion when it comes to variable NDs for the price. Just a bit more versatility, and this would check all the boxes for me. Anyways, what do you guys think? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? What do you like about each system? And which one are you guys thinking of picking up? There will be affiliate links to these products in the description that of course support me and the channel, so I really appreciate it if you use those. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future uploads, and until the next video, happy filming.